The day began like any other in London, with the sun rising over the city and the soft hum of traffic filling the streets. Crowds were slowly gathering outside Buckingham Palace, tourists from around the world eager to witness one of the most iconic spectacles in England, the ceremonial changing of the guard. Among these visitors was a man who stood out immediately, not because of his quiet curiosity or respectful awe, but because of his appearance and attitude. He was clearly wealthy, dressed in designer clothes from head to toe, with polished shoes, a luxury watch, and a camera that probably cost more than most of the houses nearby. His movements were confident, almost arrogant, as if he owned the streets he walked on. From the beginning, it was obvious that he had a particular goal in mind: to capture the perfect photograph. Every step he took seemed calculated, from the way he adjusted his sunglasses to the way he held his expensive camera. He moved past families and solo travelers, glancing at them only briefly, as if they were minor obstacles in his path. He approached the palace gates with a sense of entitlement, weaving through the crowd and positioning himself as close as he could to the guards. The people around him were excited, whispering in different languages, pointing out the guards who stood perfectly still, their red uniforms bright against the gray stone of the palace. The royal guards themselves were a sight to behold. Tall, disciplined, and motionless, they seemed almost like statues. Their black bearskin hats loomed high above their heads, and their red jackets were immaculate, the buttons gleaming in the sunlight. Each guard stood as if carved from marble, trained to remain completely still for hours at a time. They were the living embodiment of centuries of tradition, representing a history and culture far older than any one tourist could fully appreciate. People in the crowd murmured about the guards' incredible composure, some taking photographs, others simply staring in awe. The wealthy tourist, however, did not share the same reverence. He was impatient, fidgeting as he waited for the perfect moment. He glanced at his watch frequently, muttering under his breath. His eyes scanned the crowd, searching for a clear spot, a way to get as close as possible without interference. Every movement he made seemed calculated, almost theatrical, as if he wanted to be noticed by everyone present, including the guards themselves. In his mind, the perfect photo would show him standing close to one of the guards, capturing the disciplined soldier and the opulent palace behind him. As time passed, the crowd grew larger. Families with children, solo travelers, and small tour groups jostled for space, all eager to see the ceremonial change. Cameras clicked, smartphones recorded, and excited chatter filled the air. The tourist, however, grew more restless. He was frustrated by the people in front of him, annoyed at the slow pace, and irritated by the rules that prevented him from getting too close. His impatience built up like a pressure cooker, and he began to ignore the unspoken expectations of respect and decorum that others followed. It was not just his impatience that set him apart. It was also a sense of entitlement, a belief that the rules did not apply to him because of his wealth and status. He adjusted his designer jacket, brushed imaginary dust from his perfect clothes, and took careful steps to ensure he was perfectly visible for his photograph. While others whispered about how incredible the guards were, he seemed to see them merely as props in his personal photo opportunity. This attitude created a subtle tension in the crowd. Some tourists noticed it, others only felt the energy without fully understanding why it was different. Nearby, the guards continued their routine with impeccable discipline. One guard, in particular, caught the tourists' attention. Tall, with a serious expression beneath the towering bearskin hat, he stood as still as a stone statue. His eyes, barely visible beneath the shadow of the hat, scanned the crowd occasionally but never wavered in posture. To the guard, the crowd was just part of the job, a constant backdrop to his duty. To the tourist, however, the guard represented the ultimate challenge. Someone who could not be easily photographed in a flattering, dynamic way because of his strict immobility. The tourist's anticipation grew as he tried to find the best angle for his camera. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, muttering complaints under his breath about the crowd blocking his view. Each step forward brought him closer to the guard, and with each step, the murmurs of the crowd grew more noticeable. Families tried to keep their children away from the line of sight, and some tourists whispered to each other about the man's lack of respect. But he seemed oblivious, focused entirely on achieving the perfect shot. At one point, he crouched slightly, trying to frame the guard and the palace gates in a single photograph. He moved his camera carefully, adjusting the lens and the angle. The crowd around him began to notice his behavior more distinctly. He was no longer just a tourist, but someone who was pushing boundaries. Some people frowned, while others whispered quietly to each other. Even though the atmosphere was mostly cheerful, a subtle tension began to form around him. It was clear that something was about to happen, even if no one could predict exactly what. Meanwhile, the guard remained perfectly still, as if sensing the energy around him, but choosing to ignore it. He had been trained for years to withstand all sorts of distractions, from screaming tourists to sudden loud noises. His focus was unwavering, his posture flawless. To anyone watching, he was the picture of calm professionalism, the living embodiment of centuries-old discipline. The contrast between him and the restless tourist could not have been more striking. One was the image of restraint, the other of impatience. The tourist, growing increasingly frustrated, made a small, muttered comment, unaware that cameras around him were already capturing every detail. Some tourists tried to step around him politely, but he refused to yield. Every action he took seemed designed to assert dominance over the situation, to signal that he was in control. Yet, in reality, he was teetering on the edge of chaos, about to make a decision that would not only shock the crowd, but also teach him a lesson he would never forget. As the minutes ticked by, the anticipation grew. The guard's stillness contrasted sharply with the tourists' growing restlessness. Families watched nervously, some trying to warn the man quietly to respect the rules, while others simply stepped back, unsure of how to handle the situation. The tension was almost palpable, like the calm before a storm. The crowd, initially excited and cheerful, now felt a mixture of curiosity, unease, and suspense. Everyone could sense that something significant was about to unfold. Finally, the tourist positioned himself directly in front of the guard. He raised his camera, focusing intently, and took several photographs. The guard did not move an inch, his expression unchanged, his posture perfect. The man muttered to himself, adjusting the lens and shifting slightly to get the ideal angle. At this point, it was clear that his impatience and sense of entitlement had reached a tipping point. The crowd held its breath, some watching in horror, others whispering about the man's arrogance. In that moment, the wealthy tourist was not just another visitor. He had become the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. His desire for the perfect photograph, combined with his disregard for local customs, created a situation that was tense, charged, and unforgettable. What happened next would forever change his understanding of respect, discipline, and the way he viewed the world around him. The stage was set for an event that would capture the attention of the crowd, the guard, and eventually, the world. The moment that had been quietly building tension finally arrived. The wealthy tourist, who had been impatient and restless for so long, did something that shocked everyone. In a brief, thoughtless instant, he spat directly at the royal guard standing in front of him. The sound of the act was almost imperceptible, but its effect rippled instantly through the crowd. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. Families clutched their children, some tourists stepped back in disbelief, and a few people even shouted, demanding that the man stop and show respect. Cameras and smartphones, already raised to capture the ceremonial change, now recorded this shocking act. Despite the incident, the guard did not flinch. His face remained expressionless, his posture perfectly straight, as if nothing had happened at all. The bearskin hat atop his head did not move, and his eyes, hidden slightly beneath its shadow, remained focused and steady. Trained for years to withstand all manners of distractions and disrespect, the guard knew that reacting with anger or frustration would only escalate the situation. Instead, he held his composure, silently demonstrating the remarkable discipline that had made him part of one of the most respected ceremonial units in the world. The tourist, on the other hand, seemed almost exhilarated by his own audacity. At first, he laughed quietly, thinking that he had created a shocking but harmless moment that would amuse those around him. He glanced at the crowd, expecting perhaps laughter or amazement at his boldness. What he did not anticipate was the mix of horror, disapproval, and silent judgment that radiated from everyone nearby. Tourists whispered among themselves, their words a combination of disbelief and admonishment. Some parents quietly instructed their children to look away, emphasizing that the man's behavior was not acceptable. The tension in the air was palpable. People around the tourist began recording videos, not only for social media but also as evidence of what had happened. Others simply stared, frozen in disbelief. For a moment, it felt as though time had slowed. The peaceful, ceremonial atmosphere that had surrounded Buckingham Palace that morning was suddenly charged with unease. It was clear to everyone that this was no ordinary tourist behavior. This was an act that crossed the boundaries of respect and civility. Security personnel and palace staff quickly noticed the disturbance. They moved calmly but decisively toward the tourist, signaling that his behavior was unacceptable and that he needed to leave the area. Unlike the tourist, who seemed oblivious to the consequences, the staff knew exactly what to do. They maintained professionalism and control, carefully guiding the man away without making the situation escalate further. Their training allowed them to manage both the tourist and the crowd with calm efficiency, ensuring that no one was harmed and that the ceremonial routines could continue uninterrupted. Meanwhile, the guard continued to stand still, an unwavering figure amidst the chaos. Every person watching could see the stark contrast between the tourist's impulsive behavior and the guard's discipline. While the tourist had acted out of momentary arrogance, the guard represented centuries of tradition and training, embodying a calm strength that seemed almost unshakable. People in the crowd whispered to each other, marveling at the guard's ability to remain composed, even in the face of such blatant disrespect. Many later admitted that this moment left a lasting impression on them, showing that true dignity is not just about appearances but also about how one responds to provocation. The tourist, as he was being escorted away by security, finally began to realize that his actions had consequences. At first, he tried to joke about it, laughing and speaking in a way that suggested he thought the situation was trivial, but the reality soon set in. Officers quietly informed him that public misconduct at a place as significant as Buckingham Palace could lead to fines, detention, or even legal action. Cameras, smartphones, and eyewitness accounts meant that his behavior had already been documented in detail. Social media posts were beginning to spread, with viewers from around the world expressing outrage at the incident. Despite the initial tension, the crowd began to relax slightly once the tourist was escorted a safe distance away. Families resumed their positions to continue watching the ceremony, and the atmosphere slowly returned to one of respectful curiosity. Yet the incident had already left a mark, turning what was meant to be a simple, joyful morning at Buckingham Palace into a moment that many would remember vividly. Tourists whispered to one another, sharing their disbelief, and some even commented on how the guard had responded with incredible composure. For many, this was a lesson in how to handle disrespect with calmness rather than anger. As the tourist was led away, he began to notice the reactions of others around him. People stared, their eyes reflecting disappointment, disbelief, and a sense of moral judgment. Some tourists whispered, "How could he do that?" or, "That's so disrespectful." Social media users had already begun posting about the incident, sharing video clips and photos with captions condemning the tourist's behavior. In an instant, the man realized that his moment of thoughtless bravado had transformed into a public spectacle, one that painted him in a very negative light. The guard, still standing at his post, continued his duties as if nothing had occurred. This steadfast composure made a strong impression not only on the crowd but also on the tourist, who began to feel the first pangs of regret. In that moment, he could see clearly that the guard's calm response was far more powerful than any angry reaction could have been. The lesson was subtle but unmistakable. True strength and dignity come from self-control, not impulsive actions. Nearby, tourists began sharing their experiences with each other. Parents used the incident as an example to teach their children about respect and proper behavior in public spaces. School groups discussed the importance of following rules and understanding cultural customs when visiting another country. Even casual visitors, who had initially come simply to watch the ceremony, found themselves reflecting on the significance of the moment. The event had unexpectedly become an educational experience, showing the impact of one person's behavior and the importance of reacting with patience and respect. Security staff ensured that the tourist remained at a safe distance from the palace and the crowd. They did not escalate the situation with harsh words or aggressive actions. Instead, they maintained a calm and professional demeanor, further reinforcing the lesson that control and patience are far more effective than confrontation. The tourist, now realizing the gravity of his actions, began to feel a mix of shame and embarrassment. The initial thrill of attention and audacity had faded, replaced by a growing awareness that he had made a serious mistake. Later, as the crowd watched the guard continue his duties, many people commented on his exceptional professionalism. Some tourists posted videos online, praising the guard for his calm and dignified response. Others shared their own experiences of witnessing disrespectful behavior in public and noted how rare it was to see such patience and composure. The guard, unknowingly, had become an example of how discipline, training, and a calm demeanor can transform a moment of potential chaos into a demonstration of respect and authority. The tourist, escorted away, now faced the reality of what had happened. Social media posts were already circulating widely, and news outlets had picked up on the story, highlighting both the disrespectful act and the guard's remarkable response. The tourist began to understand that his behavior had consequences beyond the immediate moment. It had become a lesson observed by thousands of people around the world. For the first time, he started to feel a sense of accountability and the need to reflect on how he had conducted himself. The incident left an unforgettable impression on everyone present. For the crowd, it was a reminder that even in moments of joy and celebration, respect and decorum are essential. For the tourist, it was the beginning of a long, humbling lesson about patience, respect, and humility. And for the guard, it was another day of duty performed with perfect composure, a quiet reminder that discipline and dignity often speak louder than words. As the tourist walked away from Buckingham Palace, escorted by security, he couldn't shake the image of the guard's unflinching stance. The act that had seemed bold in the moment now appeared foolish and reckless. He began to realize that respect is earned not through wealth or status, but through understanding, patience, and the ability to control one's impulses. In that realization, the tourist took the first step toward understanding why some traditions endure, why some roles demand such discipline, and why true dignity is far more powerful than any act of arrogance. Once the tourist was escorted a short distance away from Buckingham Palace by the security staff, the reality of his actions began to sink in. At first, he tried to laugh it off, brushing it aside as a harmless joke or a moment of boldness. But the expressions of the people around him told a different story. Families, tour groups, and solo travelers had been quietly observing him, and their faces reflected a mix of disbelief, disappointment, and moral judgment. Even without a single word spoken aloud, the weight of their disapproval pressed heavily on him, creating an uncomfortable awareness that he could no longer ignore. Nearby, the crowd's focus slowly returned to the ceremonial changing of the guard, but the tension remained. People whispered among themselves, recounting the shocking incident. Some tourists speculated on what might happen next, wondering whether the man would be arrested or face more serious consequences. Others discussed the remarkable composure of the guard, who had continued standing perfectly still throughout the ordeal, unaffected by the spitting. It was clear to everyone that this moment would remain in their memories far longer than the routine of the ceremony itself. The tourist began to notice that several onlookers were recording videos on their smartphones. It was not just tourists in the immediate vicinity, but passers-by who had heard about the incident online or through social media notifications. The realization that his behavior had been documented from multiple angles brought a creeping sense of shame. What had seemed like a bold or humorous action in the moment was now transforming into something much more serious. A public display of disrespect captured and shared instantly around the world. Security staff continued to maintain control, guiding the man calmly but firmly. They were careful to avoid escalating the situation, understanding that anger or aggression would only make it worse. Instead, they spoke to him quietly, explaining the potential consequences of public misconduct at a location as significant as Buckingham Palace. They reminded him that the guards represented centuries of tradition and that disrespecting them was not a trivial matter. Every word seemed to chip away at the tourist's initial bravado, replacing it with a growing sense of accountability. By now, the tourist's laughter had faded completely. He felt a mix of embarrassment and anxiety, realizing that he had crossed a line that could not be easily ignored. Local police officers, already nearby, observed the situation closely. They approached with calm authority, making it clear that this was not merely a minor infraction. The combination of security staff and law enforcement created a sense of seriousness that weighed heavily on him. The tourist could no longer pretend that his actions had no consequences. Meanwhile, the royal guard who had been the target of the tourist's disrespect continued his duties without any outward reaction. To the casual observer, it seemed almost superhuman, standing still for hours, maintaining perfect posture, and never showing even the slightest hint of frustration. People in the crowd marveled at his professionalism. Many began taking notes mentally, reflecting on the lesson inherent in his calm demeanor. This contrast between impulsive arrogance and steadfast composure was a silent but powerful reminder of the importance of discipline and patience. The incident quickly caught the attention of bystanders who were more than casual observers. Some tourists began posting videos online in real time, sharing the shocking moment with friends and followers across social media platforms. The story spread quickly, with captions describing the act as disrespectful and praising the guard for remaining calm. Comments began pouring in from people around the world, expressing astonishment and disbelief at the tourist's behavior, but also admiration for the guard's unshakable professionalism. Within minutes, the tourist's moment of recklessness had become a global spectacle. As he was moved further away from the palace gates, the tourist began to feel the first pangs of genuine regret. The reality of being the center of public criticism, combined with the knowledge that cameras had recorded every second, started to weigh on him. He noticed whispers and pointed fingers from people walking past. Children stared at him with puzzled expressions, their innocence reflecting the obvious lesson. Respect matters, and every action has consequences. The tourist could no longer deny that he had acted selfishly, thinking only of his own amusement and desire for attention. The guard's example continued to resonate with the crowd. Families discussed among themselves how remarkable it was that the guard did not retaliate or express anger, even after such an affront. Tour guides quietly explained the history behind the ceremonial guards, emphasizing the years of training and discipline required to stand motionless for long periods, and the responsibility they bore in representing centuries of tradition. Children listened attentively, and even some adults found themselves reflecting on their own behavior in public spaces. The lesson was clear. True dignity comes from composure, not confrontation. The tourist's embarrassment grew as he realized that social media was amplifying his mistake. Videos of the incident circulated widely, shared by people commenting on his disrespectful behavior and the guard's exemplary patience. The tourist's attempts to laugh it off were ineffective. Viewers around the world could see that he had crossed a boundary that many considered sacred, even if he had wealth, status, or influence. These things could not erase the act or its public documentation. The lesson of humility was beginning to sink in, slowly replacing his earlier sense of entitlement. As the ceremony continued without further incident, palace staff and security monitored both the crowd and the tourist. They ensured that the man remained at a safe distance and could not interfere further. The tourist, now silent and introspective, observed the changing of the guard from a distance. It was an entirely different experience from what he had anticipated. Instead of feeling exhilarated or powerful, he felt small, aware of his own behavior and the judgment of those around him. For the first time, he began to see the value in respect, tradition, and patience. Nearby, tourists continued discussing the event. Many praised the guard, emphasizing the importance of self-control in difficult situations. Parents used the moment as a teaching opportunity, explaining to their children that reacting with anger is often less effective than responding with patience. School groups reflected on the moral lesson inherent in the guard's reaction. Even casual visitors who had come to Buckingham Palace simply for sightseeing found themselves contemplating the deeper message that respect and discipline often have more impact than wealth or audacity. The tourist, escorted by security, finally began to understand the consequences of his impulsive actions. What had seemed like a brief, thoughtless act had transformed into a public lesson observed by hundreds in person and thousands more online. He realized that his behavior had not only embarrassed himself but also disrespected a long-standing tradition that many people held dear. Slowly, he began to feel the first true sense of humility, a recognition that actions matter and that disrespect can have far-reaching effects. By now, social media posts were spreading rapidly. People praised the guard's patience and highlighted the stark contrast between impulsive arrogance and disciplined composure. Some posts even went viral, showing the incident as a modern lesson in dignity, restraint, and the power of calm under pressure. The tourist, realizing the extent of his mistake, felt a growing sense of urgency to reflect on his actions. It was no longer a simple matter of embarrassment. It had become a global lesson in accountability and respect. Even as he walked away under the supervision of security staff, the tourist could not escape the lesson he had just learned. Every glance from the crowd, every whisper of disapproval, every camera lens that had captured his act reminded him that behavior in public spaces carries consequences. Wealth and status could not shield him from embarrassment or judgment. The experience was slowly transforming him, shaping a deeper understanding of humility, respect, and the importance of considering others in one's actions. The royal guard, still at his post, remained unaware of the full extent of the public reaction. He continued his duties with the same discipline and composure that had defined him for years. To the crowd, he had become more than a guard. He was a symbol of patience, dignity, and the quiet power of self-control. The tourist, reflecting on this, realized that the guard's calmness had spoken far louder than words ever could. It was a silent lesson that would remain with him far longer than any photograph or video he had hoped to capture. As the crowd began to disperse and the tourist was led away from the palace grounds, the weight of the moment settled firmly on his shoulders. The laughter and confidence that had carried him through the morning were gone, replaced by a deep awareness of his own impulsive behavior. He had acted selfishly and recklessly. But in doing so, he had also learned one of life's most important lessons. Respect, patience, and humility are far more powerful than wealth, status, or momentary boldness. The incident, though brief, had already left a lasting mark. The tourist would remember this moment for the rest of his life, not as an amusing anecdote, but as a humbling lesson in discipline and respect. And for those who had witnessed it, both in person and online, it became a story that would be shared repeatedly, a modern reminder that true dignity is revealed not in how one asserts oneself, but in how one responds to challenges with calmness and composure. After the tourist had been escorted a safe distance from Buckingham Palace, he felt a heavy weight of shame settling over him. His boldness and impatience had turned into embarrassment, and he began to realize that his actions had not only disrespected the guard but also the centuries-old traditions of the palace. Yet, just as he started to think that his lesson was complete, an unexpected opportunity arose, one that would leave a far deeper impact than mere embarrassment ever could. A few minutes later, palace staff approached the tourist with a calm but authoritative manner. They invited him to step aside and speak privately, explaining that they wanted to give him a chance to understand the significance of his actions. The tourist, still feeling anxious and unsure, hesitated at first, but curiosity and a growing desire to make amends prompted him to follow. He was led through a quiet hallway, away from the bustling crowd outside, the sounds of tourists and cameras fading as he entered a more controlled, serene part of the palace grounds. There, he was introduced to the guard who had been the target of his disrespect. At first, the tourist felt a wave of nervousness. He had imagined a confrontation filled with anger or harsh words, perhaps even a formal reprimand, but what he encountered was entirely different. The guard, still in uniform, stood calmly and spoke in a measured, steady voice. There was no anger, no sarcasm, and no attempt to humiliate him. Instead, the guard explained his role and the traditions he represented, providing insight into a world the tourist had barely considered. The guard began by describing the long history of the Buckingham Palace Guards. He spoke of centuries of service, the discipline required to maintain perfect posture and composure for hours at a time, and the responsibility of representing the royal family in a manner befitting tradition and respect. The tourist listened intently, realizing for the first time that this was not just a job but a calling that required dedication, patience, and humility. The guard's words were calm but filled with authority, and they carried a weight that the tourist could not ignore. As the conversation continued, the guard shared personal stories from his own experiences. He described moments when tourists had behaved rudely or made inappropriate comments, yet he had learned to remain calm and professional in every situation. He explained that discipline was not just about standing still, but about controlling one's emotions, responding with dignity, and representing something larger than oneself. The tourist, listening to these stories, began to understand that the guard's composure during the earlier incident had been far more powerful than any angry response could have been. The tourist's feelings shifted from shame to awe. He realized that his impulsive behavior had been not only disrespectful but also short-sighted. He had acted as though the guard was an obstacle in his path rather than a symbol of centuries of history and discipline. Hearing the guard speak about his role and the significance of the traditions he upheld, the tourist felt a deep sense of humility. For the first time that day, he truly began to see the value in patience, respect, and self-control. The guard then gently asked the tourist to reflect on why he had acted the way he did. The tourist admitted that his impatience, frustration with the crowd, and desire to take the perfect photograph had clouded his judgment. He had acted out of selfishness, thinking only of his own amusement and attention. The guard nodded, not with judgment, but with understanding, and explained that recognizing one's mistakes is the first step toward personal growth. This simple but profound message struck the tourist deeply. To reinforce the lesson, the guard invited the tourist to witness a small demonstration of the training and discipline required for his role. The tourist observed how guards maintained their posture, executed precise movements during ceremonial duties, and responded to potential distractions without losing focus. The guard explained that this training was not just physical, it was mental, requiring control over impulses and emotions. Watching this, the tourist felt a growing respect for the dedication and patience that the role demanded, and he realized how little he had understood before. As the demonstration ended, the guard shared a personal reflection. He spoke of moments when he had been tested, times when tourists had tried to provoke reactions, and how he had learned to respond not with anger, but with calmness and composure. The tourist was struck by the wisdom and maturity in these words. He began to understand that humility is not weakness, but strength. He realized that every action has consequences, and that the way one responds to challenges defines character far more than wealth, status, or audacity ever could. The tourist began to ask questions, seeking to understand more about the life of a royal guard, the history of Buckingham Palace, and the traditions that governed their conduct. The guard answered patiently, explaining the honor of the role, the centuries of history it represented, and the importance of discipline in maintaining that legacy. The tourist listened, fascinated, and for the first time felt a genuine connection to the tradition he had so carelessly disregarded. This unexpected conversation transformed his perspective, turning what had begun as a moment of shame into an opportunity for learning and reflection. By the time the tourist left the private area with palace staff, he had undergone a profound internal shift. His initial feelings of arrogance and entitlement had been replaced by humility and respect. He looked back at the guard standing at his post, fully aware of the extraordinary patience and dignity displayed. The tourist understood that the guard's calm response had not been passive, it had been deliberate, teaching a silent but powerful lesson about respect, discipline, and self-control. Outside, the crowd had begun to disperse, returning to their sightseeing and photographs, But the tourist's thoughts were consumed by the conversation he had just experienced. He realized that he had been given a rare chance to learn from someone who embodied discipline and wisdom. Unlike any formal punishment or reprimand, this encounter had left a lasting impression that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He had learned that actions matter, that respect must be earned and given, and that humility is far more valuable than momentary pride or boldness. Social media, which had been rapidly circulating videos of the earlier incident, now began to carry a different narrative. Some posts highlighted the guard's patience and professionalism, emphasizing the lesson he had imparted without anger or ridicule. People from around the world praised the guard, noting how rare it is to see such calmness under provocation. The tourist, reflecting on this later, felt a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment, grateful for the unexpected teaching, and embarrassed at the thoughtlessness of his earlier behavior. The guard's example became more than a story for the tourist, it became a model for how to handle challenges in everyday life. The tourist began to think about other situations in which he had acted impulsively or arrogantly, realizing that patience and respect could have led to far better outcomes. The lesson extended beyond Buckingham Palace, teaching him a broader understanding of how dignity and composure can influence both personal character and public perception. By the end of the day, the tourist felt a deep sense of transformation. What had begun as a moment of reckless behavior had evolved into a meaningful lesson in humility, respect, and personal growth. The guard, through calm explanation and demonstration, had turned a potentially humiliating situation into an opportunity for reflection and learning. The tourist left Buckingham Palace not only with a story to tell but with an understanding that true dignity comes from self-control, respect for others, and the ability to respond to challenges with patience rather than anger. This encounter remained etched in his memory long after he returned home. Every time he thought about Buckingham Palace, it was not the grand architecture or the ceremonial changing of the guard that came to mind first. It was the quiet, patient guard who had turned a moment of disrespect into an unforgettable lesson in humility. The tourist had been humbled, educated, and inspired, all in a few short hours. And he knew that this experience would shape the way he viewed respect, behavior, and human interaction for the rest of his life. As the day at Buckingham Palace drew to a close, the wealthy tourist walked slowly away, still feeling the weight of the morning's events pressing upon him. The sun had begun to dip lower in the sky, casting warm light on the palace gates and the proud guards who continued their duties with quiet composure. The tourist could not help but glance back repeatedly at the guard who had taught him a lesson that no money or privilege could ever replace. That calm, unwavering figure standing tall against centuries of tradition had left an impression deeper than any photograph or souvenir ever could. He reflected on the incident, replaying each moment in his mind. The act of impulsively spitting at the guard, which had initially seemed amusing or daring, now appeared thoughtless and foolish. Every step of the morning had taught him something. The impatience he had felt while waiting in the crowd, the arrogance in thinking that the rules did not apply to him, and the sense of entitlement that had fueled his behavior. Each of these moments had been a lesson in humility, and he began to see how differently he could have behaved. By the time he reached a quiet street nearby, he realized that his understanding of respect had transformed completely. The palace guard's calm response had been more powerful than any scolding or punishment could have been. Instead of reacting with anger, the guard had chosen to educate, to demonstrate dignity, and to embody the very lesson he wished to impart. The tourist now understood that true strength does not come from aggression or audacity, but from self-control, patience, and the ability to act with integrity, even under provocation. The tourist's thoughts soon turned to the broader consequences of his actions. Social media had already spread the story, capturing every moment from multiple angles. Videos showed his impulsive act, the guard's unwavering stance, and even the careful way security had handled the situation. Comments poured in from people around the world, many praising the guard's professionalism and patience. Others reflected on the importance of respecting history, tradition, and public service. The tourist realized that this global attention could have been disastrous for him, but instead, it became a teaching moment for countless people, further amplifying the lesson he himself had learned. Feeling a mix of embarrassment and gratitude, the tourist decided to take action. He found a quiet corner with internet access and carefully wrote a message acknowledging his behavior. He admitted that his actions had been inappropriate and disrespectful, and expressed sincere regret for what he had done. More importantly, he shared the lesson he had learned from the guard, that respect, patience, and humility are far more valuable than momentary boldness or seeking attention. The post was met with mixed reactions, but many people appreciated the honesty and the willingness to reflect on one's mistakes. As he continued his walk through the streets of London, he thought about the countless tourists and visitors who had been present that morning. Families, school groups, and casual observers had all witnessed his impulsive behavior. Some had been shocked, others had been upset, but many had also been inspired by the guard's calm response. The tourist realized that, in a strange way, his mistake had created an opportunity for education, not just for himself, but for everyone who had seen it. It was a humbling thought, and one that left a lasting impression on him. Later, as he returned to his hotel, he found himself thinking deeply about the role of the palace guards. These men and women were not simply ceremonial figures. They were living symbols of history, discipline, and dedication. They maintained a tradition that spanned centuries, often under intense scrutiny and in the presence of crowds that could be unpredictable. The tourist reflected on how little he had appreciated their work before that morning. Now, he felt not only regret for his own behavior but also admiration for the commitment and composure required to fulfill such a role. The experience stayed with him as he prepared to leave London. Each moment of the day had been a lesson, and he knew that it would continue to influence him long after he returned home. He thought about humility and the ways in which people sometimes let pride or impatience guide their actions. He thought about the power of responding with dignity rather than anger, and how such responses could leave a lasting impact on others. Most of all, he thought about respect, the kind that is earned not by wealth, status, or audacity, but by understanding, patience, and integrity. When he finally boarded his plane home, the tourist found himself reflecting on the event with a sense of gratitude. The experience at Buckingham Palace had been unforgettable. Not because of the wealth he had displayed or the audacity of his actions, but because of the powerful lesson he had learned. He thought about how he could apply this lesson in everyday life, in situations that required patience, understanding, and humility. He realized that true respect begins with oneself and extends outward to others, creating harmony and understanding in even the most challenging circumstances. The tourist's reflection extended to the people who had observed the incident in person. Families who had seen the interaction, school groups who had discussed it, and casual visitors who had witnessed the moment. All of them had been touched in some way. The guard's quiet, disciplined response had taught a lesson far broader than the one the tourist had initially experienced. It had reminded people that dignity, patience, and respect are qualities that transcend culture, nationality, and status. The tourist understood that this lesson would continue to resonate for years, influencing how others interacted with public spaces, history, and one another. Back in his own country, the tourist shared the story with friends and family. He recounted not only the incident but also the conversation he had had with the guard, the demonstration of discipline, and the unexpected wisdom he had received. He spoke openly about his mistake, expressing both regret and gratitude. Friends listened, some incredulous about what had happened, others deeply moved by the transformation he had undergone. For the tourist, sharing the story was a way to honor the lesson and ensure that it was not forgotten. Over time, the tourist's understanding of the incident deepened. He began to reflect on the broader implications of his behavior, thinking about how respect and humility play a role in everyday interactions. He realized that small acts of thoughtlessness can have significant consequences, and that responding to such acts with patience and dignity can create a powerful ripple effect. The lesson he had learned at Buckingham Palace became a guiding principle in his life, shaping how he approached challenges, relationships, and public behavior. The tourist also thought about the role of education in unexpected moments. He realized that some of the most important lessons are learned not in classrooms, but through real-life experiences and personal reflection. The guard had provided him with a unique form of education, one that could not be found in books or lectures. By responding with patience, dignity, and understanding, the guard had transformed a moment of disrespect into a profound opportunity for growth. The tourist understood that this lesson was rare, and he felt a deep sense of gratitude for having experienced it firsthand. Years later, the story continued to stay with him. Whenever he reflected on behavior, patience, and respect, the image of the guard standing calmly at Buckingham Palace came to mind. It became a symbol of the power of composure, the importance of humility, and the impact of thoughtful action. The tourist carried this lesson into every aspect of his life, sharing it with others and applying it to his personal and professional interactions. What had begun as a moment of recklessness had become an enduring guide for living with integrity and respect. Ultimately, the tourist realized that the incident at Buckingham Palace was unforgettable, not because of the wealth he had displayed or the audacity of his actions, but because of the transformation it sparked within him. He had learned to value humility over pride, patience over impulsiveness, and respect over entitlement. The royal guard's calm, disciplined response had not only corrected a moment of misbehavior, but had also inspired a lifelong understanding of dignity and self-control. For the tourist, this was a gift far more valuable than any photograph or souvenir he could have taken home. And so, the story came full circle. What had begun as a shocking act of disrespect had ended as a profound lesson in humility, patience, and respect. The tourist returned home, forever changed by the quiet strength of a royal guard and the timeless lesson he had imparted. This unforgettable experience reminded him and everyone who heard the story that true dignity is not measured by wealth, power, or audacity, but by the ability to act with calmness, composure, and respect, even in the face of provocation.